Thank you, Jose. Thank you to everyone who came today. We have our very own Shanna Farrell here. She's an interviewer with the UC Berkeley with our Oral History Center, and she specializes in culture, the environment, and beverage history. She, as we have said, she's the author of the new book, A Good Drink in Pursuit of Sustainable Spirits, and also Bay Area Cocktails, a history of culture, community, and craft, both of which draw on oral history methods. She also served as co-chair for the 2020 Oral History Association Annual Conference, and she holds her master's degree. She has 2 master's degrees from both NYU and Columbia University. And of course, she's a great colleague for us here at Bancroft. So welcome today, Shanna. Thank you so much, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much for having me and for everyone for joining us today. I'm really excited to be here to talk about my new book, A Good Drink. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about the process of writing the book and how I used oral history methods for both my research and for crafting the book's narrative, and using those techniques really helped me explore what's at stake when we don't treat spirits as agricultural products. So first, I just want to give you a little bit about the overview of the book. So it's really about the role that spirits play in the food system and why we don't really consider them to be agricultural products. And then also what the environmental impact of distilling and bartending is. But it's told through stories of those who are extending eco-consciousness from the kitchen to the bar, and also from the distillery to the bar as well. So each chapter, each chapter follows a different set of characters to engage with the environmental issues that are particular to each category of the spirit. So chapter 1 starts with whiskey, chapter 2 is about agave, and so on and so forth. So each chapter is a different category of spirit. And then in the last chapter, which is all about scale, the characters come back together at the end. So first of all, I wanted to go over how I did the book. I did a lot of research trying to figure out what kind of information is out there. This is sustainability and distilling, and even in bartending is kind of a newer thing. It's a newer topic. There are people that are doing this work, but they're kind of siloed from each other. So there's no real groundswell of work going towards environmental impact in distilling. So I was trying to figure out what was out there, what some statistics existed, who are the people that are doing things. I did a lot of preliminary research and looking at interviews and different websites, looking at bottles of things to try to figure out who are the people who are creating these models. And then what I did was I made initial contact with the narrators in the book and had some preliminary conversations with them, including a pre-interview. So this really follows the oral history method of talking to someone and letting them know what I'm working on, that it's going to be a book, that I'm hoping to interview them, that it'll be recorded, kind of what the end life of things are going to be. So really being collaborative, being transparent about things. And then often I would also put together an interview outline, which is similar to oral history as well. And if a narrator wanted to see the interview outline, I gave them the opportunity to, because even though I was asking them different questions, I wanted them to know what my agenda was. And so they would have they could either prepare in advance or they wouldn't feel like I was doing any gotcha journalism. And then after we had the pre-interview, we did the in-person interview. And this kind of varied. I did a lot of field work with this as well. There were a few times when I was in Charleston, South Carolina. I went to Mexico. I went to Denver, Colorado. And then over the bridge, I live in San Francisco, so I went to the East Bay and Alameda to talk to the folks at St. George Spirits. And then when the pandemic hit, these interviews took place on Zoom. So in the rum chapter, I did interviews with 2 different rum companies, and they were all over Zoom. So varied a little bit. But with the in-person interviews, I also did a lot of field work as well. So going on distillery tours, visiting farms, that kind of thing. And then from there, I used those interviews and the research that I had done to write the narrative. And then once that was done, using an oral history method as well, what I did was I sent the section that the narrator was in, that I was using their words, And I sent that back to them just for a few different reasons. Fact checking is one of them. So if I got any of the details wrong, like, we actually opened in 2012 and not 2013. And actually this type of grain is considered an heirloom, not a landrace, that kind of thing. This was really helpful in getting that fact checking off the ground. And then I wanted approval from them. I wanted to make sure they felt like they were represented fairly, but I wasn't allowing them to change my voice or the narrative structure or anything like that. There were some incidents that I can talk about a little bit later about how one person didn't necessarily understand why I was talking about something and how that pertained to things. And I kind of had to let them know about the larger context of the book. So that's a process that I followed. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the interviews that I was doing. First, I have all these people that in mix of in-person and group interviews and also Zoom interviews, and I'll go through these. So first, I talked to Highwire Distilling Company, which is in Charleston, South Carolina. They open up the book. It's owned by a husband and wife team, Ann Marshall and Scott Blackwell. And I've known them for years, and I've done a number of interviews with them. And this is all where the story starts. And when you read the book in the introduction, it gives you a sense of why. But they're using landrace grains, which are antebellum grains. They're not using commodity corn like lots of other distilleries do to make a specific type of bourbon or whiskey, but it's called Jimmy Red Corn Bourbon. And this is Anne holding some of the cobs of the corn. They're really bright red. They're very promiscuous. They're really flavorful types of corn. And so through my multiple interviews with them, I learned about how distilleries can create direct relationships with farmers and how the distillers can play a role in how different ingredients are grown. So, are you irrigating your land? Are you using GMO crops? Are you spraying pesticides? Are you practicing crop rotation? These are the things that distilleries, when they have a direct relationship with a farm, can really have more control over. And most whiskey distilleries use genetically modified corn. It's a type of commodity corn called yellow dent, and they don't even know what state it comes from. So there's this huge disconnect between the actual ingredient and the product that's being made. And I think this further disconnects the connection between agriculture and spirits. So that was one of the surprising things that I learned during the interview. And then next I talked to, this second chapter is about agave, and I talked to Pedro Jimenez, who is the proprietor of Mizonte. And what that label does, he's not actually a mezcalero or distiller, but he works with a lot of mezcaleros in all of Mexico, mostly focusing on the state of Jalisco. And he works with people who are practicing environmental, sustainable practices in their agave production, and also trying to keep the cultural and the historical traditions alive in the way that they're distilling. And I was really thinking about representation in this chapter. There's a lot of, living in the United States, especially in San Francisco, it's the #1 market for agave spirits in the entire country. But there's a lot of people who are from the States who are telling the stories, who are selling this product to other people in the United States. And I really wanted to make sure that I had someone from Mexico to tell the story of Mezcal because it comes from Mexico. And Pedro fit that bill, especially because of his environmental consciousness. So he discusses, the environmental impact, how the producers grow and harvest agave, and what techniques they're using to carry on those traditional practices. And I learned a lot from him, especially why it's important to think about scale. So when a mezcalero who often grows and harvests the agave themselves, which is unlike tequila. In tequila, a lot of humidors or field hands harvest things for them because agave is also a commodity crop. He's really talking to them about how much can you grow without overtaxing the ecosystem? How do you keep things in balance to make it sustainable? So if you need the money, like if you're a producer who's really thinking about, I want to scale up, because I need to make more money. He'll work with you and think about what the other areas that you can capitalize on are, instead of growing more agave and overtaxing the environment. And this was a great example of how these stories don't exist in a vacuum and you can't separate them out. They're connected to a lot of things like politics and economics and sociocultural history, that kind of thing. And one thing I also really appreciate about Pedro is that he keeps most of that mezcal in Mexico and doesn't export as much as many of the other companies. And then the next person I talked to was Scott Leopold, and this is for the gin and vodka chapter. So this company is owned by two brothers, Todd Leopold, who is the distiller, and Scott, whose background is in environmental engineering. And I don't hesitate to say that this is the most environmentally advanced distillery in the entire country. All of the systems are really in service of lowering their carbon footprint, whether that's the energy they're using coming from solar power. Denver, I realize, is because it's so high up, the sun is so hot, so you get a lot of power from the sun. And they're also using local ingredients. They have their own malt house, so they're malting their own barley and using it to make their own neutral grain spirits like vodka that they use for their gin and a bunch of other liqueurs. Everything is local. This story is really kind of driving home the idea that you can make a spirit that is pretty much all the ingredients come from within 50 miles of the distillery. And what does that mean? And many distilleries kind of source their Nutri-Grain spirits from large companies who are, again, using commodity crops. And they're really focused on making something that tastes like the Denver area and captures the spirit of Colorado. But also their water systems are super efficient. I mean, it just looks like pipes on the wall until Scott explained all of it to me and like how all of it works. They grow native grasses right outside of the distillery, and they use open tank fermentation. So there's wild yeast. They're not adding anything. They're using wooden fermentation tanks so that they can't use chemicals. Those kind of seep into the wood. So they're trying to use the spent alcohol to clean things up as well. And there's all these fans that are over the fermentation tanks that kind of blow in these native yeasts and all of the scents from the native flora and fauna that surround the distillery. So that was a really great experience getting to go there. And then next I was the rum chapter, and I talked to a couple of different people for this one, Ian Burrell and Karen Hoskin. Ian is based in the UK and Karen is based also in Colorado. She's in Crested Butte. And photos of them respectively with their different products. So rum is also a really incredibly complicated category with a pretty dark history. The impacts of colonialism and slavery are still felt today, both socially, economically, and environmentally. And Ian's company, Equiano, really addresses this. This is a newer company. He's using sustainably sourced sugarcane that's organically grown. He's really thinking about that. And also the name Equiano goes back to the man Equiano, who was born into slavery and then eventually became a rum runner and was able to buy his way out of slavery and ended up going on to write a book. So even in the name, all of this is woven in there. And he's got a really interesting story. The distiller that he works with can be a polarizing figure. He doesn't add any additives to his rum and is very vocal about making everything transparent. And then Karen runs a certified B Corp distillery, meaning that everything they do environmentally, socially, and with their hiring practices and everything economically, they are transparent. Everything is measured. So, all of the carbon footprint from where their sugarcane comes from, that's sourced from Louisiana and also organic farm. What is the carbon footprint when you harvest that and then have to ship it to Colorado? What kind of ink are you using to print your labels? What kind of glass are you using for your bottles? And I think they even use snow melt for some of their cooking practices when they're actually cooking and distilling their rum. So she is all about radical transparency, and their website is full of information about what they're doing to lower their carbon footprint as well. So that's a really interesting example. And then next, I went across the bay to Alameda to speak with Lance Winters and Dave Smith of St. George Spirits. And St. George, if you're unfamiliar, it's kind of our hometown heroes. They opened in 1982, the first craft distillery to open since Prohibition. It was opened by, if you're looking at this image, Jorg Rupf, who is the man all the way on the left. Lance is in the middle and Dave is on the right. And Jorg grew up in Germany, distilling brandy in his backyard, like a lot of his neighbors, and really wanted to, when he opened the distillery, brandy was the flagship product they were using. It was eau de vie, and really wanted to capture the essence of the fruit in the bottle. So no additives, no artificial ingredients, really just capturing the fruit in season and getting the fragrance there. Dave, the person on the right, really thinks about how you capture the perfume of things. He's really interested in that. But since they've been around for almost 40 years, there's this question of consistency and how do you keep things consistent? This chapter really focuses on climate change. We're in California. We know that we're dealing with the impacts of climate change every day with water, fire, and drought and those kind of things. And so I wanted to talk to them about what choices they're making and how they're making these choices in the face of climate change. What are the trade-offs that they have to make? So this chapter in particular really illustrates the spectrum of decisions that have to be made going towards when you're working towards sustainability. And so, this isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. In California, they were getting, when Jorg was at the helm of the operation, he was getting a lot of his pears from Mendocino because they reminded him of what he grew up with in Germany. And then as agricultural demand in Northern California changed, a lot of those orchards were getting ripped up for Pinot Noir grapes. And they had to look to actually Colorado to get the pears that they use now. So that's, a trade-off they have to make to kind of keep their product consistent over a period of time. But then also, both Jorg and Dave had to evacuate because of the fires that happened a few years ago. So this is the backdrop of the decisions that they're making. And then next is about bartenders. So, it's one thing when you're sourcing, when, you're thinking about the ingredients, the environmental impact of actually making the spirit, but what happens when a bartender is using things? So I interviewed Craig Lane, who worked at Bar Agricole in San Francisco for many years, Ian Griffiths and Kelsey Ramage. Ian is Australian, Kelsey is Canadian. They met in the UK working at a bar that Ryan Chetty-Yaradana was running. And the three of them were working on a large scale, thinking about how do you reduce waste in the bar field, whether that's pre-freeze using ice so you don't have to, eliminating ice from a bar program, or buying alcohol in bulk so you didn't have single bottles, that kind of thing. One thing that Ryan is, and that's a photo of Ryan Chetty, one thing he's really considering is the psychological component and why people think that sustainability and luxury can't coexist. So through his high-end bars, these are award-winning, world-renowned bars that really challenge this notion and having this experience. And he's thinking about the environment through this as well. And Ian and Kelsey are really about reducing ingredients and reducing waste. They started a bar resource now called the Trash Collective about how second and third life of ingredients and that kind of thing. But this is also interesting because each different city has a different municipal system and they all handle waste separately. So we're lucky in the Bay Area, we have composting, we have recycling, but that doesn't really exist in a lot of other cities around the country. So these are some of the things that they're addressing. And then lastly, I wanted in the last chapter, I really wanted to look at scale. And so what happened, it's all well and good when you're independently owned or you're in sole control of your company, but what happens when demand is high and you need to scale up? So for this, I talked to Jason Nally, who at the time was the environmental champion at none other than Maker's Mark in Kentucky. And so I went down to Kentucky. I was very skeptical about what that was going to look like. I was very upfront with them, like, I don't even know if this is going to make it into the book, but they were pretty confident in what they were doing. And what I found there was, so they a few years ago got bought out by a multinational company and got a ton of investment, just this like giant infusion of cash. So they were thinking about how to scale up their operations. They distill 24 hours a day. Most of their fermentation tanks are actually landmarked because they're using a particular type of cypress wood. They've been around for so long that they were able to build those. Cypress, I guess, is in short supply, which I learned at the Leopold Brothers distillery because of the show. I think it's Swamp Hunters with the cypress trees. So anyway, their stills are landmarked. They can't really make any more, but they run their operations 24 hours a day. But the big thing that I took away is that they are really focused on being good stewards of the land. They are situated on a campus that has its own watershed, and they control 100 of the 101 acres of the watershed. So they're really concerned about water quality. All of the water they use comes right from their property. And so they have to be thinking about water quality and that kind of thing, and groundwater, how things are being irrigated. They do work with a family-owned farm to get their grain. However, they do use commodity crops, and I believe it might be genetically modified. So that's a trade-off that they make. But they're also really interested in forest health. It's not something that I thought about when I was starting the book. It was only through these interviews that I really got to see that you're aging all these things, most of these products in barrels. And in Kentucky, part of the law is that you have to have, or part of the rules that govern whiskey is that you need new oak. It's virgin wood. And that's incredibly wasteful if you're just chopping down trees to age one type of spirit. A lot of times these barrels get sold, but it's still part of the process. And so Maker's Mark is working with different initiatives to look at forest regeneration. And that was a newer consideration. So again, like lots of different trade-offs and that kind of thing, but quite interesting nonetheless. So just a note about using the interviews. So after I did all this field work, I talked to all these people, I looked at, what are the themes that are emerging here? What are the really salient points? And then also using my own curiosity as a gateway for potential future readers. What are the things that I'm finding most interesting or like the biggest sticking points, and how can I work that into the book? So using my own curiosity there. And then I was able to use a lot of these quotes and my field work and this kind of thing to create the narrative arc. Transparency was a big part of it. I was definitely letting all of the narrators know, as I mentioned before, what I was doing and getting consent from them saying, hey, I'm going to be using this. Do I have consent? Just explicitly asking for that. And everyone who made it in the book obviously gave me their consent. And I did mention the fact checking as well. One thing that I sent Jason Nally at Maker's Mark was a bit about the role that enslaved people played historically in making whiskey, and he didn't really understand why that was a part of the book. I also had visited a cooperage that makes these wooden barrels, and there were still, you could tell, some like holdover structural issues from that, and that's in the book. They took me to this cooperage, and he couldn't really understand why, and I had to kind of explain, we're looking at the whole picture here. And so that was one sort of example of pushback I got, but it was a conversation that we were able to have. And so I'm going to do a short reading. I've been talking all about this book and these interviews and things like that. So I'm going to give you a sense of what the actual narrative is like. So I'm going to read from the first part of chapter 4, which is about rum. One thing as the book launched last month, a lot of the questions I've been getting is about additives and that kind of thing. So, and also why we don't treat these things as agricultural products. Where is the disconnect? So the introduction of this chapter deals with that. All right, chapter 4, rum. Every time I'm dining at a restaurant that promotes itself as farm to table, the kind that lists its purveyors and the farms where its ingredients are grown, I ask to see the spirits menu. Or if I'm sitting at the bar, I'll spend a few minutes scanning the bottles that neatly line the shelves behind the bartender. What bitter liqueur do you use to make your Negroni? I'll ask. What I really want to know is whether the bar uses Campari, a bold Italian aperitif known for its bright red color and viscosity. Campari is so common that it's become synonymous with a Negroni. You rarely see a substitute, but nevertheless, I always ask. Usually, one of three things happens next. If a substitute is available, I'll order my cocktail with that. If my only choice is Campari, I'll order a different drink. The third scenario, which can be tiresome for my dining companion, especially if it's my husband John, since he's heard this routine countless times, is when the bartender will cock her head and ask me why I'm asking, wondering what I have against Campari. It's not that I don't like the taste of Campari, quite the opposite, actually. Its taste and texture are so iconic that its flavor profile is the baseline for other aperitifs. If an alternative is much sweeter, people will think it won't balance a Negroni. If it's thinner, people will think it gets lost in the drink, despite its bitterness. My issue with the liquor stems from that eye-catching red color, which doesn't naturally occur during the distillation process. Campari, like other companies that make aperitifs, used to dye their ingredients with cochineal bugs. Sorry, vegans. These beetles, which are native to the Americas, imbue liquid with the color carmine. It was a natural dye, nothing that was made in a lab by mixing synthetic chemicals. That changed in 2006 when the company cited uncertainty about the longevity of the supply of cochineal bugs. Campari switched to red dye number 40, an artificial coloring agent that has been linked to cancer, stomach issues, migraines, anxiety, and allergic reactions. It's found in many common foods like Skittles, Jell-O, and Gatorade. If people are aware that they're consuming red dye number 40, that's their choice. But if you're a restaurant or bar owner who claims to be carefully sourcing ingredients that are organic, non-GMO, and grown without help from pesticides, carrying alcohol with synthetics completely contradicts your other efforts. Simply put, the same principles are not applied evenly to both food and beverage. Wine and beer may get some attention, but spirits usually fall by the wayside. That's why I insist on annoying bartenders with my questions, because we don't ask enough of spirits. We don't expect as much. But cocktails are ingested the same way as our meals, a sip and a swallow, and deserve to be more than an afterthought. It may not occur to people who think of themselves as mindful eaters, aware of the food system, to question why a spirit is bright red, but it should. We have the power to spend our money on alternatives, to ask what else is out there, to customize our Negroni orders. The issue goes beyond just red dye number 40. In the United States, alcohol production and particularly the labeling on bottles are regulated by the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, or the TTB, not the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA. Though the FDA has a list of ingredients that are generally recognized as safe, that is GRAS, it's GRAS, which applies to both food and spirits, the government doesn't regulate spirits the same way as food. The TTB regulates and collects taxes on trade and the import of alcohol and firearms and tobacco, which essentially deals with the business side of the industry, leaving the production and everything else that goes into it, like farming, distilling, and bottling, out. The regulation is about taxes and trades and not about what can and cannot go into a spirit. The FDA, on the other hand, is responsible for protecting public health by ensuring the safety, efficacy, and security of food and other things that we put into our bodies, like drugs and vaccines. If the federal government doesn't see the importance of treating alcohol like food or of transparency from those who make it, the general public won't either, furthering the divide between public perception of food and alcohol. That GRAS list, GRAS, includes many ingredients used by industrial distillers, including coloring agents like red dye number 40s, sweeteners such as high fructose corn syrup, tannic and polyphenolic substances, easier to write than say, which are insoluble in water, inorganic salts, essential oils derived from herbs and spices, flavoring agents like caramel and petroleum, which adds body. Many of these things are made from genetically modified crops. These additives, most of which are artificial, often take the place of more natural, recognizable ingredients. That strawberry liqueur in your favorite summer cocktail, there are probably no real strawberries in it. The flavor was created in a lab, added to the base spirit after it was distilled. The blueberry vodka you drink with soda, you're better off muddling fresh blueberries in yourself. That cinnamon flavor in the whiskey you used to drink when you were in your 20s, it came from a flavoring agent. The herb flavored creme that gives your cocktail a green color, that hue came from a dye. Another trick that many producers use is to create the illusion of age by adding caramel. After a spirit has matured in a barrel for a period of time, it comes out brown, the barrel giving it both flavor and color. Often, the spirit's proof is quite high and needs to be watered down to a drinkable alcohol by volume, so it's not too hot or unsafe to swallow, and this process lightens the color. To correct the color, distillers and blenders might add caramel to darken it. This is a practice so common that it's controversial to take a stand against it. But many companies aren't transparent about what they're adding, whether it's caramel, honey, or something artificial, or disclosing where the ingredients came from. And this is the problem. As someone who values transparency from producers, I like them to tell me upfront that they don't add anything to their juice. And if they do, I like them to tell me that too, so I can make an informed choice about whether to drink it. This is what led me to Equiano, an Afro-Caribbean product that was launched in 2020. The brand has transparency and traceability and uses no additives or artificial ingredients. And so then the book goes into the Equiano section, and then after that, the Montagna rum with Karen Hoskin, who actually does add a small percentage of caramel to her products, but she's transparent about it. So yeah, that was the reading, and thank you so much for joining me. I'm happy to take your questions. And just for a little bit of a plug for the book, if you haven't had a chance to buy it yet, for the rest of the month on my publisher's website, it is 50% off. So I'll drop a link in the chat. But thanks so much for joining me, and I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Yeah, if you can please drop that link. I added the one from bookshop.org so that because that is, I like to contribute to independent bookshops. So that's another way to do that too. So thank you for doing that. And I have not seen any questions yet, but if anybody has a question, you're welcome to either drop it in the chat or raise your hand. There's a little button and the reactions, options down at the bottom, and you can raise your hand. Is there a raised hand? Oh, Christine.
Yeah, hi. Hi.
Sorry.
Thank you so much, Shanna. That I learned a lot. That was really, really interesting. I wonder who your hoped for audience is for this book. I mean, are distillers sort of sharing this amongst themselves? Do you know, like, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was definitely something that I thought a lot about when I was writing the book. It's definitely, I think, for distillers, it's for people who care about the environment, who care about the food system. It's for the bartending community. And yeah, people who are just curious drinkers, I think, who haven't really considered these issues. And I definitely was thinking a lot about audience when I was writing the narrative. So it's, it's narrative nonfiction. And part of the reason I wanted to write it that way is because these issues can be kind of heady. And if I'm just, fact, doom and gloom, that kind of thing, it's really hard for the audience to connect with the points that I'm trying to raise or the people that I'm interviewing and talking to. And so I wanted to use myself as kind of that point of connection and my own curiosity to explore these issues and present some of the people who are creating great models.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, David. I think it's a really good idea to think about what we are consuming, right? And to look at the labels. Yeah. And thank you, Rita, for your comment. I appreciate it. Yes, I was also not aware of Campari or the cochineal. I mean, I'm familiar with cochineal for a ton of other things, but not for Campari. So Todd, you have a question.
Hey, thanks so much, Shanna. Well, as one who quit drinking like 20 years ago, this is all like new, right? But I will say, as one who also followed food politics for like the last 15 plus years, do you think this is also something that you're on the verge of something that's going to become more popular? Because if we think about too, like in the last 10, 15 years, how much now we really, with food politics, we really look at what we eat. That's become really a heightened awareness, I think, broadly across society, to where like we look at Chick-fil-A. Like, who would have thought 10 years ago you would have a place outside of KFC, right, that just specialized in chicken, right? Like, I never would have thought that would be as popular as it is now, that you have to sit for like 30 minutes in the drive-thru when my kids want to go, right? So do you see this as maybe gaining steam with alcohol, that people are going to start really thinking more about what they consume? Or is this also, if we think about maybe just in the cocktails, is it also a demographic of drinkers too, who may really start caring rather than your Bud Light crowd? No offense to the Bud Light people.
Yeah, that's thank you for that question. I think right now it's a certain demographic of people. I am really hopeful that it'll catch on. And actually, as speaking of Bud Light and Coors Light, as I was writing this book, and this was pre-pandemic, driving from my home in San Francisco across the bridge to work on campus, there were these giant Budweiser and Coors Light billboards that were talking about how they're not using genetically modified crops. And it was like they were competing with each other. So it was like, wow, this is becoming more mainstream. People are caring a little bit more. But this is definitely my hope with the book. This is the first like full length book of its kind. And it can be a little threatening to people. People don't want to think about the commodity farm issue when they're drinking bourbon. But I think there's a lot more magic and in using these heirloom varietals, doing things more environmentally consciously. And I'm hopeful that out of this, there'll be more conversation, and people who are doing things and are part of that certain demographic will be less siloed and kind of come together. And, there's a working group that's addressing this across different beverage industries right now, but it does tend to be more wine and beer. There's less spirit focus. So I'm hopeful that the spirits will follow suit. And in bartending, because it's easier to think about waste and like how much water you're using, if you can recycle, there are a lot more bartenders who are paying attention to this right now too.
Thank you. There's one more, there's another question from Roger on if there is any connection between the Leopold brothers and the ecologist and environmental author Aldo Leopold.
Yes, so we actually spent quite a bit of time talking about Aldo Leopold in my interview with Scott. They think that there is a family connection, and I actually had it in the first draft of the book, but we couldn't fact check it, so we had to take it out. They did not have the family records, but I do think that that Aldo Leopold was a big influence in both Todd and Scott Leopold's life. Their father actually was a landscape architect for the Bureau of Land Management. And so, these had been parts of their lives growing up. And, a Sand County Almanac was referenced a number of times. So yeah, I think so. Can't be proved though. Yeah. And just a note on the Campari aspect of things. I saw a couple of the comments on that. If you are interested in an alternative, there are quite good ones. St. George actually makes one. It's called Bruto Americano. That is no artificial additives, dyed with cochineal bugs. And then also it's very kind of piney though. They use a lot of bay laurel in there. And, but I will also say that Cappelletti makes a really great one, as do the Leopold brothers. So there are some great alternatives that are widely available.
So David, do you want to ask your question, or can I go ahead and just read it?
Sure, I can ask it if you can hear me.
Yep.
I just wondered if there's consumer reports on things that tell you about products. Is there something, can you imagine someone creating a publication that would rate beverages, beers, spirits, about the extent to which they're positive for the environment or not, and using additives? I just think that's an opportunity for someone to really bring something else to the market.
There's a few that are out there right now. They're done by independent kind of consumer report groups. And that was really helpful in finding some of these facts out. But I think because, you know, the regulation is different. I mean, these companies aren't required to disclose what ingredient, as long as it's on that generally recognized as safe list, they're not required to disclose that. And bottles of liquor don't have to have an ingredients list on it. So, it really is up to, sadly right now, consumers to do that legwork. It's kind of how I was finding this stuff out. I was doing a lot of Googling. And I will also say that it is pretty obvious when you go to a distillery's website how transparent they are. You know, if they're like, you go to St. George, either go to this distillery, go to the website, look at any of their interviews. They're really open about what they're using. And I think that that is something, you know, if you follow your instincts on that, but there are people who are like, yeah, we're not going to tell you what's in any of this. Or if they can't tell you what's in something, I think that's a red flag too. So yeah, but yes, I think this is a great opportunity for someone to write a consumer report. Probably won't be me, but I think it's great for someone to do.
So I'm curious if you found other reactions to these changes, right? So like Campari being an example that everyone knows about that. Were there at that time when that change happened, was there any reaction? Or are people not really finding out? Is this one of those things where we just sort of consume it and not really know?
It happened very quietly when they stopped using the cochineal beetles. And when people did ask, they did say, yeah, we stopped using this. But it was years later until people started to kind of honestly taste the difference. And I think that their reason was that they were worried about the sustainability of cochineal beetles, which is, I don't know if there's real merits to that argument or not. But then a few years ago, there was an article about this in the New York Times. And I think that's when people started to get more aware. But because it's so ingrained, I mean, people feel really threatened when you change their ingredients and are like, well, it's not the same. It's not the same. People feel threatened when you ask them to use an alternative. So yeah, I think people just keep drinking it.
Can I ask you a question about, I feel like there was a little bit maybe of tension, but maybe not between, okay, when you were talking about bartenders and their efforts to reduce waste. And one of the ways they can reduce waste is using like larger containers instead of smaller bottles. But how do they buy like some of this small batch, like greatly, you know, well-sourced alcohols? Can you buy like from Leopold Brothers, can you buy like a big vat, or not a vat, but you know, a large enough thing that's less wasteful? Or, I mean, so is there a tension between waste and small batch distillery products?
Yeah, there is quite a bit. And the UK is regulated a lot differently than the United States. The United States, you're not allowed to buy in volume. I think that the biggest you can buy is a liter of something, but it all has to be single use. And you can't, you know, go back because of this dates back to Prohibition, but there's something called the 3-tier system. So before Prohibition, alcohol was regulated federally. And then when Prohibition got repealed, one of the provisions was that alcohol had to be regulated state by state. And something called the 3-tier system was implemented. And that means that a distillery can't sell directly to a consumer. There has to be a middle person there. And that was supposed to make it so that the distillery didn't get too powerful. Well, the impact of that really has been that the distributors now have gotten very powerful, and they have a lot of reasons why they don't want to sell things en masse. In other parts of the country, they are able to do that. I know that there's a company out of Singapore right now that is able to sell things in big vats to places around the UK, or sorry, around Europe, around Asia. And that makes a huge difference because you're reducing so much from the waste stream there. And unfortunately, you know, if I were to buy a bottle of, let's say, gin from St. George, and I was like, well, it's kind of silly, I want to be able to refill the bottle, I'm not allowed to go to the distillery. They can't reuse it. That's against the law. So there's a lot of limitations and roadblocks in the United States. I'm hopeful that that'll change. I think it's going to take a lot of people to really push back against some of these things. But again, I think part of that is because of the way it's regulated. And I unfortunately don't see that changing anytime soon.
But raising awareness is also a good way to start that. So I think, yeah, I think you're doing a tremendous work for that. I want to second Lark's question. What interested you? What got you into this subject?
Yeah, so I was a bartender for very many years, over a decade. I started working in restaurants when I was in college. And then when I was in graduate school, I was working at a bar in Brooklyn. And my graduate work was, my first degree was an interdisciplinary master's, and I was doing what I like to call environmental anthropology. It was a create your own adventure, and I was interviewing people about how they had been affected by water pollution along the Hudson River and how that looked differently for different people. Or the impact of that was different for different people. And so I'm doing all these interviews, I'm thinking about the environment, I'm thinking about the role of water, I'm bartending. And then at night, there was, on our back bar, there was this really beautiful bottle of New York State produced whiskey. And it was very expensive at the time, and I could never really afford a pour. So I would just turn this beautiful bottle over in my hand. And on the label, it said that it was made with 100% New York State grain. And I also realized that the distillery was set up along the banks of the Hudson River. So I was like, great, I can interview these people for my thesis work. And so I ended up interviewing the founder, and he was talking about, from an economic perspective, he wanted to create a direct relationship with a farm and cut out the distributor there. So he was able to negotiate a better rate, get things locally. And actually that ended up reducing the transportation, all the emissions that come from transportation. And it had, to be completely transparent, not my favorite whiskey of all time, but it had such a bold, distinct flavor. And I think you could really taste the difference in the grain there. And then fast forward to moving to Northern California several years later, being at restaurants that have, the farms where the lettuce was grown or the protein was raised, that kind of thing. And at this point, knowing there's these additives and things, flipping the menu over and looking at the cocktails and seeing that there was no good alternatives to Campari and that kind of thing. And I was like, why is there this disconnect? And then what really kind of brought things home was I was doing, for my first book, it's about the Bay Area cocktail revival, so interviewing a lot of bartenders who were part of this revival in the Bay Area, including Thad Vogler. I did an oral history interview with him. He owned Bar Agricole for many years and also treats spirits as agricultural products and is very considerate about how he's sourcing things. And we would get into these conversations. And I think through those conversations, I really started to think, wow, why aren't we talking about this more? Why aren't people concerned about this? And so that's really where it all started. I will say that originally I wanted the book to be about just solely about water, but that was incredibly niche. And I don't know that anyone would have really read that. So we kind of broadened it up to other environmental issues. So, yeah. Oh,
yeah, did you want to?
Yeah, Roger is wondering what became of the oral history interviews you conducted for the book. So I will say that for my first book, I did oral history interviews, had a release form. They're, all signed off on. For this book in particular, I was using oral history methods. I wouldn't necessarily, my style of interviewing was all oral history based, but I was taking a little bit more of a journalistic approach where it was I had consent from them, but there was no agreement about archiving these interviews later. So I have all of the interviews at home and use the transcripts and that kind of thing, but I don't know that these interviews will ever be archived anywhere because they're not formal oral history interviews.
Can I ask you a quick question about the discount on the book that you mentioned?
Sure. Yeah.
So you gave us the link to Island Press, and I heard from one of the participants here that they went and tried to buy the book, and there was no 50%.
I think it's applied at checkout. So when you go to the page, it still says full price, and then when you go to check out, it should automatically be applied. Because Island Presses, I was told that their entire inventory, like all of their books, are all 50% off. So
Oh,
this one,
okay.
it's their entire catalog.
Okay, thanks so much for helping clarify
Yeah,
that.
absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. This was a really wonderful talk. I really learned a lot, and I really thank you for joining us. And thank you all for coming today to hear us speak with one of our Oral History Center interviewers. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a pleasure.
Thanks again. And we'll see you, hopefully we'll see you next month for James Eason's talk on Northwest Boundary photographs from the mid-19th century. Check your emails.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Have a good day.
Shanna.
Thank you.